Welcome to the Whole Child Sleep podcast, where we help families nurture dreams and raise wholeness. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Whole Child Sleep podcast. I'm your host, Myra Hartzheim. Today, we are talking about a topic similar to what we discussed last week on what is general sleep coaching. Today, we are tackling a question I get quite frequently, which is, what do we believe in when it comes to tiers and sleep training or sleep coaching? What I want to focus on as it relates to sleep coaching or sleep training and tiers is what neuroscience and psychology have determined as it relates to tiers and stress and children. What studies have found is that there are three types of stress that our children experience. First is positive stress. That is stress that results in growth. This is stress that is short in duration and it results in growth in the end. Then there's also what's called tolerable stress, stress that raises stress levels in the body, maybe isn't as short in duration, but there is a responsive and caring adult to help buffer what could have been toxic stress. Talking about toxic stress is when a child experiences stress that impacts the stress levels internally and that there is no buffer for that stress. There is no caregiver that is able to co-regulate that stress. When we're talking about general sleep coaching, we want the stress to remain in the positive, and maybe sometimes it ends up in the tolerable stress zone. What we want to avoid, however, is the toxic stress zone. We want our children to experience stress in a way that allows for growth. Let's look at an example that is not related to sleep. So if we drop our kids off at school or at a new daycare, we want there to be a caring and responsive adult there to help buffer any stress they're experiencing in the new environment, right? We can help that transition by exposing them to that area before they begin attending there. We can go with them to that new space and environment with them, acclimate them to that new area. So that all will help that stress spike be less of a stress spike. Does that make sense? However, sometimes they are exposed to a new environment, say a new school or a new daycare, and they haven't had that introduction. So we might be more into like the tolerable stress zone in that situation. And what would be a toxic stress situation is if then we drop the child off, there is no adult to buffer the stress they're experiencing, the newness of it, and then they have even a negative experience there. Say, who knows, maybe an adult that was a negative experience for them in that environment. So those are three different examples of how positive, tolerable, and toxic stress looks like. So in the sleep realm, what would that look like? To avoid going into the toxic realm zone, right? You want the child, when learning new sleep skills, to be with calm, loving, responsive adult during the transition. Or at least have the option to, when the child is experiencing stress, to be able to be responded to by a loving, caring adult caregiver. So that really leaves a lot of zone for flexibility. What that could look like in the positive stress realm is, well, maybe instead of holding baby on my chest while we're laying down to sleep, maybe we could actually snuggle on the side, right? baby won't like it. Maybe will cry for a little bit until they adjust to the new way of falling asleep. However, there's a caring and loving, responsive adult there to help buffer that stress, right? And maybe they feel a lot of stress during that one transition from holding baby on the chest to falling asleep with them on the side of the bed. But that won't go into the toxic realm zone if there is a responsive, caring adult with them during that transition. What we encourage families to avoid, if possible, is doing the cry it out method, where we throw baby on the deep end of the sleep training experience, if you will, to leave them by themselves to cry alone. That may be in the toxic realm zone. However, if the child has some sleep skills already and that situation is not stressful to them, it may not be in the toxic realm zone. Does that make sense? Say, if you introduce the child to a new daycare environment, they're pretty familiar with it, and they get dropped off and they're there by themselves, say for 5 minutes with other children, that may not be a toxic experience. Does that make sense? There are so many factors to consider. However, during the process of introducing a new sleep skill, we encourage and we want parents to be there with their children as they learn a new sleep skill. I hope this was helpful and answers questions as it relates to general sleep coaching and tiers. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you all next week. Thank you for listening to the Whole Child Sleep podcast. For references to articles discussed in this podcast or for evidence on the topics that we've discussed on this podcast, please look in the description below, or you can find the articles linked in our blog at curesleep.us. I want to give you an idea of what you can expect in terms of structure of this podcast moving forward. You can expect one podcast a week, and we will cover a topic for 2 weeks. The first week, you can expect the podcast to be more educational and informational. The following week will be more of a Q&A covering the same topic. If you have a question that you would like us to answer during the Q&A podcast, please send them in at 406-551-4083. And if you've found this podcast to be helpful, we ask that you share it. We would love to reach more tired families. We also ask that you subscribe and like and give us a 5-star review. This also helps us reach more tired families. We hope you have a beautiful day, and we will talk to you next week. By listening to this podcast, you understand and agree to the following. The content of this podcast offers the opinions of Meyer Hartzheim and her guests, and it is not intended as medical advice. It serves as an informational purpose. For personalized and medical concerns, consult your healthcare professional. The views and opinions in this podcast are our own and don't represent our employees or affiliates. The views of the guests in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect that of Cure Sleep Group. Our podcast and website are not for legal purposes, such as establishing a standard of care or expert witness testimony. We don't guarantee the accuracy of statements or opinions. We appreciate your assistance in maintaining content accuracy. If you find errors in our podcast or blogs, please reach out via email to support@curesleep.us. This podcast is owned by Cure Sleep LLC and presented by the Whole Child Sleep podcast. Thank you for tuning in.